I'm Jeanette Stanley, and I was born in Jamaica and came here at the age of 14. Went to school for a short period of time and then went into being a cadet nurse and then student training as a nurse, and left that after the first year, after being on nights, because it used to interrupt my weekends going out. And from there, I went into different jobs, one of them being a data punch card operator. And I think I lost my way a bit there. My mum was really upset because she wanted to be a nurse and saw her dreams fulfilled into me, but it wasn't really for me at that time. I was kind of headhunted to work at GMCVO. It was a white organisation, and it was like how CVSs are these days. So they were responsible for sort of supporting voluntary sector organisations, and I suspect, because I was from the community, it was a good catch. So I worked with them in training young people who were sort of on placements with us. I was responsible for them, and I also did some admin work. After working there a few years, there was an organisation called Full Employ, which was a national organisation that had its head office in London. And I remembered my manager telling me, oh, that job would be ideal for you. And I thought, yes, no way. And someone I knew at Careers Office rang me and said, I've seen a job and I think it's for you, Jeanette. And they were looking for managers and also staff to train people. So they were saying, go for the manager's job. And I thought, no way. So they mithered me that much that eventually I applied for a job as a tutor, office skills tutor. Didn't say anything to them, just said that I'd applied. Following that, Full Employ wrote to me, offered me an interview. And when they sent the information, it was for a manager's job. And I thought, somebody's made a mistake here. And I mentioned this to one of my colleagues, and she says, no, they haven't. You'd be good as a manager. Anyway, I went along with it, went to the interview, wasn't stressed out at all because I knew I hadn't applied for that job. And halfway through the interview, I thought, oh, I'm really excited about this. I wish I could get this job. And I thought I'd blown it. But the following day, they rang me and said, we offer you the job. So I got the job as office skills manager, and we were based on Portland Street at that time. So we developed the project with the development manager from scratch to being one of the most successful in Full Employ right across the board, because we used to get support from people like Kellogg's, Norweb, all the large organisations, the banks, Barclays Bank, and we had a board of directors which involved also people from the private sector. So we in Manchester were very popular. We had Kellogg's giving us 20,000 a year, every year, and Norweb, whatever we wanted, if it was equipment, if it was £5,000 to do a course, they'd give it to us. So we were very, very successful. We even had Prince Charles coming to see us. And, it was a lot of media coverage, which sort of set us on the map. Unfortunately, Full Employ isn't there anymore, but a number of people who went through the training, I've got some of them here as staff, who went through the training because they did office skills as well as enterprise training. And people are still in jobs, and some of them become teachers, gone on to university to do various different things. So it was very successful. Well, at the time, the climate was very, very difficult for people from the African and Caribbean communities to get employment. And particularly if people lived in Moss Side, there was a postcode discrimination. So we had JobLink, which used to be part of the trust, which is this organisation here. And we were the training arm. So we used to do customised training for people to go into employment. So some of the training we did was for the university, Norweb, Kellogg's, the post office, a lot of various organisations. And what we did, we had people from those organisations actually coming in and doing mock interviews with the clients, so that when they went to interview, they would have gone through, you know, an interview, a mock interview. So it was really real and life. They used to come dressed as if they were going to a proper interview. And a lot of them got jobs from that as well. And AED, we're on the same site. I didn't actually work for AED, but we're on the same site. And they actually worked with people who wanted to go into enterprise, set up their own business. And they also did what I recalled a very useful program where people who'd had gone into prison came out and retrained them to do whatever they wanted to do, maybe go into business. Yeah. You really had to try and get funding to do the things you wanted to do to better the community, because obviously we knew that people were being discriminated against because they had a Moss Side address. And once you, in those days, once you said I live in Moss Side, it might be hip now, but then once you live in Moss Side, you know, you're a drug runner, you've got guns, etc., you know, all the things that goes alongside with it. So you were excluded from the labour market, hence that's why it was important for us to do the things we did. And I think at that time, NatWest and Barclay Bank was very supportive to the community as well. It's because there was so much to be done within the community. We had various groups, and I was involved in the Family Advice Centre. I was on the management committee there. I was also involved with MOSHWAF, which was a women's organisation, Moss Side and Hume Women's Forum, Action Forum. And we were set up, the Women's Action Forum was set up in 1994. And our aim was to empower women and enable them back into employment and education. So a lady called Judy Craven, I don't know if you know, she worked extensively with the Manchester Education, and she developed a program that enabled women to go back to university or into employment. Many of them who had been off bringing up children, being single parents, and those were the sort of things we did as the Women's Action Forum, and challenging society and the establishment to give women equal opportunities. Obviously with Mrs. Da-Cocodia at the head of the organisation as a chair, because when it was established, she was the first chair. A lot of men found us intimidating, especially maybe counsellors and people like that. But we were successful because as women who've struggled on their own to bring up children and sometimes get a career going whilst your children are at school, going to university, having to do essays, housework, bringing up your children and all that, it's not an easy task. So, you know, we experienced it, most of us, and we were able to pass this on to empower other women from the community. Louise was the sort of person that wasn't selfish. She empowered other women and anybody, even men, who were around her. She was always encouraging. And another thing that she encouraged me to do was to become a Justice of the Peace between her and a lady called Mrs. Robson, who was the wife of Professor Robson, who was at the Manchester University. Glenna Robson, her name was. And I met her through various committees that I was involved in, and she was actually working in the community at the time, and she was a Justice of the Peace. And she said to me one day, "Oh, you'd make a good Justice of the Peace." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you're very balanced and you'd be fair and all of that." So she got me the forms, and I must have sat on it about 3 months. And she came to my office one day and she said, "Right, I'm not leaving until you complete this form." So I had to do it under duress. So I did it. And Mrs. D at the time was Mrs. Da-Cocodia. I call her Mrs. D. She was a magistrate at the time as well. And so I had both of them at me. Anyway, I went and was successful in going through the interviews. So I've been doing that since 1996 at the Manchester City Magistrates Court. And that's been rewarding and that's been empowering as well, because when you're in that kind of environment, a lot of the people that you're sitting with, they're from very rich families, you know, they have like 2-3 cruises a year and what have you. And their knowledge of the local community is very sparse. So being there, you're able to educate them so that when they're making certain decisions, it's more balanced. And I feel that I've done it all these years, and I'm proud that I was involved because I've enabled some people to get a better understanding of my community, and people also with mental health, because they have very little understanding and awareness of that. And throughout all that journey, I ended up here at African Caribbean Mental Health Services. And prior to me being here, the organisation was established in 1989. And again, it was Mrs. Da-Cocodia, Hartley Hanley, Charlie Moore, Geraldine White. They were involved in establishing the organisation, because when Hartley was a youth worker, he used to visit Prestwich Hospital, and he realised that a lot of young men who were missing from the area, they were actually in Prestwich. And he came back, had a discussion with the group. I think they were called Shell at one time, and discussed the fact that these people needed support whilst they're in hospitals. And they decided that they'd set up an organisation, and to cut a long story short, they got funding and they employed the first worker, and what was his name? Ferguson, Gilroy Ferguson. He was the first worker they employed. And through that, they developed further funding, and then the organisation grew in that they had other mental health practitioners, and they used to go into the hospitals, visit people who were African and Caribbean young men mostly in them days, and they were over-medicated most of the time, because there's a saying that when you're black, it's big, black and dangerous, so they over-medicated them. And the organisation initially was a campaigning organisation as well, and they would have discussions with the NHS, the local authorities, etc., to sort of educate them about being black and African Caribbean people. And the organisation grew and grew and grew. I mean, we've been around since 1989, And with all the funding difficulties over the last 20 years, because it's always been a struggle, we're still here. And I suppose because of the work that we're doing, the staff that come here, obviously we have qualified social workers and sometimes qualified nurses, mental health nurses, who work within our organisation. And they come to work with us rather than the NHS because they're putting something back into their community. And we say that our services are culturally appropriate, so that if an African Caribbean person wants that support, we know what makes them tick. So we're able to support them because we know the culture, food, everything, how we're brought up. And we use that also. We use doing that to train other NHS staff who aren't of the BME communities, who might not understand about us. Because even psychiatrists, when they're making their diagnosis, they don't understand that we use our hands a lot, because I do. And they say that we shout a lot, but sometimes it's not arguing, it's just that we speak loudly and we're very jovial. So sometimes people will get misdiagnosed because of those things that they do. So even today, we are helping the medical profession or all the other practitioners and all other organisations to understand our culture better so that they can treat people who need that help in a more culturally appropriate way. So it's not just for us, but also the wider community, so that people can understand about us and what makes us tick. I think some of the challenges were that if a black young man was behaving in a particular way, more often than not, they would end up in prison rather than a hospital. And we had to work with the police. We actually had a policeman on our board at one stage from the local police station, so that they had an understanding or could get that understanding. And we were here as a reference point also to advise. So we made those kind of links. Similarly, we made those kind of links with the hospitals, where we'd go and visit people and support them when they had a ward round or whether they had a tribunal. And we'd be able to help the medical team to understand about that person's culture and why he might do certain things. Because, as you know, as black people, we talk to ourselves a lot. And it's not that we're mental, it's that we use it as a reasoning form. And so explaining those things to them helped in the diagnosis and also in the care of those people. We'd visit places like Prestwich, where it's like a prison, and we had a lot of clients. We had one in particular who, he did something, the guy's about 69, 70 now, and he did something years ago when he was younger, and he ended up in mental hospital. His friend went to prison, did his time, when he was there forever. And he was, through our intervention, he was released to Prestwich, and then into the community. We had visited, accompanied visits to our drop-ins that we used to have, because the organisation has various drop-ins, so people can come if they're in the community and they have mental health, they can join in, whether it's art, music, life skills, a women's group, a carers group, they can access those services, and it's an added support. So he had escorted visit initially, and then when he got better, he was coming on his own, and then eventually he started living in the community. But at that time, he was 60, about 65 when he was released, when the friend that he did, whatever they did, went to prison, did his time and came out. So those were the difficulties, in that young men would go through the criminal justice system rather than going to a hospital, the mental health system. So those are things that we found as challenges. And we worked in partnership with many organisations and individuals to develop different training to educate the establishment. You know, when I say establishment, I mean the psychiatrists, the nurses, etc., prisons. You know, we've done work in prisons where we had a worker who supported people who were in prisons, because like in Manchester prison, people come from all over and they have very little support if they have mental health. And she was a psychologist, so she would have group sessions with individuals in strange ways and support them in, sometimes they hadn't heard from the solicitor or they might not have heard from their family. She was that go-between. But because of funding, because we got funding from the Home Office to do that piece of work, because of funding, that gap's there. And although sometimes the prisons will have the funding, they won't buy in the service. They talk about it, but then it doesn't come to anything. I think our challenge has always been funding. And because we're a specialist service, a lot of people, indigenous population, will not think that there's any need to have a specialist service. And you find that you're constantly having to justify why. And when you explain it to people, they do understand. Because if people from the African Caribbean community don't have a service like this, they go into any old service, it's not the same. A lot of clients we have, when they've been referred all over the place, and then they come here, they say, at last somebody understands me, you know. And sometimes when they come to us, the way they open up, they wouldn't to anybody else. And they've said it, you know, through the various things they've written, you know, response when they've had their service. And it's an ongoing struggle to sort of justify why it's right, because it's not equal for us all. We know that in our community, it's not equal at all. So we have to have those services that are specific to certain groups, whether it's women, men. I mean, there's times for us to come together, but you do need to have that. Or carers wouldn't function in a group that's got all white people, for instance. And if a number of them have dementia, they say people with dementia have long-term memory. So they wouldn't be able to sit around and talk about their days in Jamaica with a white group, if you understand what I'm saying. So those are the challenges that we have, and we still have them constantly, every day. And just being here and surviving, it's a challenge, because you're constantly trying to find funding to do something that you think would benefit from our community. And just because it's on our priority list doesn't mean that the funders, it's on their priority list. I think what I'd like to see is that more, maybe young people, I don't know whether you'd be able to use it in schools to inspire the younger ones, because a lot of them don't know our history. And I'm not talking about like the Arawak Indians and that, but our history in Manchester, in Moss Side, for instance. And I think it would be very inspirational for them to see and understand that there are people from their own community who look like them that can be in certain jobs, you know, and can have an impact on where we live, what we do, how we live, etc. Because I think our community is getting a bit disjointed in that everybody's out for themselves. It's not like in the old days when people, I mean, Hartley got beaten up by the police because of the work he did. And he has a lot of people who might not like his style, but when people like him and Eloise and Berry and Mrs. Da-Cocodia and those people were around, they were a force. You know, they didn't mess with them, you know, because the council, they'd come to them, the Chell group, they'd say, right, we're thinking of doing so and so. And until they said, yes, it was all right, they wouldn't do it. But now they just do whatever they want to do. And I think our young people need to be educated about those things. And we use a lot of volunteers within the organisation. And it's very few people who want to volunteer the services now. And most of the time, we get students who want to add that to their CV rather than trying to give something to the community and learning. Everybody wants money, but sometimes experience and education is the key, I think. So if you were able to use your projects within schools, and I know with Stennet started a program years ago in getting people who were successful to go into schools and talk to the children so that they could aspire to things. And I don't know whether that's still going, I doubt it. But things like that, because we need to get our young on board.
Jeanette Stanley, thank you very much for
You're welcome.
on the WAS project.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.